The city at night carried a mix of allure and danger. The skyscrapers glowed brilliantly, but the smaller streets remained shrouded in darkness, lit only by faint, flickering lights. Elise Carter, a young congresswoman, was hurrying home from an important meeting, dressed in an elegant suit, holding a briefcase. She walked briskly down the empty street. Elise rarely walked alone at night, but her rideshare had been canceled, leaving her no choice but to make her way home on foot. This wasn't the ideal neighborhood for a woman to walk alone, but Elise refused to let fear take over. She often reminded herself, if I let fear control me, how can I fight for others? Meanwhile, Richard Donovan, a patrolling police officer, sat in his car at the corner of the street. Richard wasn't fond of this neighborhood, which he believed was rife with crime. With a watchful but biased eye, he scanned the passers-by, looking for anything suspicious. His gaze locked onto Elise as she walked past. A thought flashed through his mind. A well-dressed black woman at this hour. In this area, something's not right. He decided to follow her. As Elise neared an intersection, Richard turned on the police car's lights, pulling her over. Startled, Elise paused briefly but quickly composed herself, her face calm but alert. "Good evening," Richard said coldly. "What are you doing out here at this time?" Elise met his gaze, trying to remain composed. "I'm just on my way home. Is there a problem, officer?" Richard stepped out of his car, approaching her with an interrogative demeanor. "Do you have identification? I need to check it." Elise frowned. "I don't believe I've done anything wrong to warrant showing my ID." Richard's expression turned stern. "I don't need a reason. This area has a lot of problems. I'm just doing my job." Elise felt her face flush with anger. She knew she was being treated unfairly because of her race. But instead of letting her frustration boil over, she calmly responded, "I'm Congresswoman Elise Carter. I just left a meeting. I have every right to walk on this street without being harassed." Richard let out a mocking laugh. "Congresswoman? A congresswoman walking alone like this at night? Do you think I'm stupid?" Elise met his gaze directly, her eyes sharp yet restrained. "I don't need to prove myself to you, but I'll warn you. You're overstepping your authority." Refusing to back down, Richard insisted on searching Elise's bag despite her protests. The tension escalated as Elise held tightly to her bag, refusing to let him search it arbitrarily. The standoff grew more intense, and a passerby happened to stop, pulling out their phone to record the scene. Elise felt her heart racing. She had never experienced a situation like this before. As a congresswoman, she had always believed in the justice system, but now she found herself a victim of that very system. Richard raised his voice, pressuring Elise. "Your lack of cooperation only makes you more suspicious. If you don't show your ID, I'll arrest you for obstructing an officer." Elise tried to stay calm, but her anger was evident. "You're abusing your authority. I won't stay silent about this." Richard ignored her words. He grabbed at her bag, but Elise held it tightly. "You have no right," Elise shouted, her eyes blazing with defiance. By now, the passerby had left, but no one knew the video had already been uploaded to social media. Richard was unaware that his actions were being recorded and would soon spark a public outcry. Finally, Richard forcefully snatched Elise's bag and searched it. Finding nothing suspicious, Elise stood there, her eyes burning with fury as she stared him down. "You will pay for this." Unapologetic, Richard replied smugly, "I was just doing my job. You should feel lucky I didn't arrest you." Elise clenched her fists, holding back her anger. "You'll regret this," she said before walking away, leaving Richard standing there, self-satisfied with his actions. Elise returned home in a whirlwind of emotions. She sat on her chair, staring blankly at the wall in front of her. The humiliation she had just endured wasn't merely a personal affront, but a stark reminder of what Black people face daily. Elise decided to call her assistant, Mia, to recount everything. Mia, who had always admired Elise's resilience, listened intently, unable to hide her anger. "Ms. Elise, this can't go unchallenged," Mia said. "We need to bring this to light." Elise nodded in agreement. "But we need evidence. He didn't know I was a congresswoman, and that's why he thought he could get away with it. I want to make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." Shortly after, Elise received a message from a stranger on social media. It was the video capturing the entire incident. The passerby had posted it, and within hours, the video began spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, Richard returned to the police station, smug about his actions. Some of his colleagues, who shared similar biases, showed their support. But as the video started to go viral, the tide began to turn. The video quickly became the center of attention. Within hours, it had garnered hundreds of thousands of views, comments, and shares. The online community was outraged, not only by Richard's actions but also by his cold, aggressive demeanor. Elise received an outpouring of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. She realized this was the moment to stand up, not just for herself but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. The next morning, the media crowded outside Elise's home. She decided to step out and address the cameras. "This incident is not just my story. It's evidence of the injustice that still exists in our society. I will not let this matter fade into silence," she declared. Meanwhile, at the police station, Richard began to grasp the consequences of his actions. He was summoned to a meeting with his superiors, where an internal investigation was announced. Richard tried to defend himself, but the video left no room for doubt. Little did Richard know, this was just the beginning of his downfall. The morning after the video went viral, the entire city was in an uproar. The media replayed the footage incessantly. News articles provided continuous updates, and social media became a platform for expressing outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForElise and #EndRacismNow trended globally. In front of Congresswoman Elise Carter's house, a crowd of journalists and supporters gathered, carrying signs and chanting slogans demanding justice. Though Elise was accustomed to the spotlight, she felt the immense pressure of this moment. She knew that every word and action she took now could influence millions. During an impromptu press conference held outside her home, Elise addressed the crowd. "What happened to me is not uncommon. It represents what countless people of color endure every day. Today, I am not speaking as a congresswoman. I am speaking as a Black woman who is far too familiar with injustice. But this time, we will not stay silent." Her speech quickly spread across the media, inspiring her supporters and energizing the movement. Major human rights organizations like the NAACP, Human Rights Watch, and prominent public figures voiced their support, demanding decisive action from the city authorities. Meanwhile, the city's police department faced a massive wave of criticism. Hundreds of calls, emails, and messages poured in from the public, demanding the suspension of Richard Donovan and a thorough investigation into his actions. Amid mounting public pressure, Richard Donovan grew increasingly tense and irritable. The police department was forced to place him on temporary suspension, pending the results of an internal investigation. This came as a major shock to Richard, who had always been confident that he was merely doing his job. Richard returned home in a heavy mood. His small house in the suburbs, where he lived with his wife and 12-year-old daughter, Emily, offered no solace. Instead, he faced questioning from his own family. "Dad, what did you do?" Emily asked. Her innocent eyes filled with worry as messages from her school friends poured in about the video of her father. Richard remained silent, unsure of how to respond. His wife, Jessica, couldn't hide her disappointment either. "Richard, this is going to ruin us. Didn't you think about me and Emily? What did you do to that woman?" Jessica's reproach stung, and Richard lashed out defensively. He tried to justify his actions, insisting he was just fulfilling his duty. But deep down, a seed of doubt began to creep into his mind. That night, Richard sat alone, drinking and reflecting on his past. He thought about his childhood in a poor household, where his father frequently spoke harshly about people of color. Those stories, those prejudices, had been ingrained in Richard's mind from a young age, shaping his worldview in ways he had never questioned. Now, with his life unraveling around him, Richard was forced to confront the truth that those very biases had led him to this moment. While Richard grappled with his internal conflicts, Elise continued to be at the center of attention. A week after the incident, she appeared at a major panel discussion on equality, hosted by prominent human rights organizations. Hundreds attended, and the event was broadcast live across multiple platforms. Elise stepped onto the stage, facing a crowd filled with expectant eyes. She knew this was her chance not only to share her story but to deliver a powerful message. "I stand here today not to talk about myself," she began. "I stand here for those who haven't had the chance to be heard, for those who are judged and condemned every single day simply because of the color of their skin. But today, I want everyone to know that we can change that." Elise's speech lasted over 30 minutes, touching the hearts of everyone present. She spoke about the pain endured by victims of racial discrimination and the responsibility each individual carries to dismantle unjust systems. Following her speech, Elise received overwhelming support from colleagues, friends, and even former critics. But she knew words alone were not enough. Determined to take action, Elise and her team began drafting a plan to introduce a bill aimed at reforming the police system. As the investigations into Richard Donovan unfolded, deeper systemic issues within the police force came to light. The inquiry expanded beyond Richard's actions, exposing a series of similar incidents that had been hidden from public view. A leaked internal report revealed that the police department had received over 50 complaints of discriminatory behavior in the past 5 years, most of which had been ignored or dismissed. The media quickly picked up on the story, posing tough questions to the department's leadership. "How can we trust a system that allows these actions to persist?" one journalist asked during a press conference. Under mounting public pressure, the police department announced plans for reform. However, the announcement did little to quell the outrage. Protests continued, with thousands of people taking to the streets, carrying signs demanding justice. Elise, despite her busy schedule, attended meetings with city leaders to ensure accountability. During a national television interview, Elise stated, "This isn't just my story or Richard Donovan's story. It's the story of a system that has gone unchecked for far too long. If we do nothing, the next generation will continue to suffer the same injustices." Meanwhile, Richard, now isolated, began to realize that he wasn't just being rejected by the public but also abandoned by the very system he had served. He started questioning whether he had truly been fighting for justice or simply functioning as a cog in a machine of injustice. The viral video didn't just upend Richard Donovan's life. It also took a heavy toll on his family. His wife, Jessica, couldn't leave the house without feeling the judgmental stares of their neighbors. Their daughter, Emily, was ostracized by her friends and subjected to cruel taunts at school. One morning, as Jessica prepared breakfast, Emily walked into the kitchen, her eyes red from crying. "Mom, I don't want to go to school anymore," she said, her voice trembling. Jessica stopped what she was doing and turned to her daughter. "What happened, sweetheart?" Emily handed her phone to her mother, showing her a text from her former group of friends. "Your dad's a racist. You're just like him. We don't want to hang out with you anymore." Jessica felt her heart sink. She had tried to shield Emily from the fallout, but it was clear that it was impossible. After a moment of silence, she pulled Emily close, hugging her tightly. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I'm sorry this is happening," Jessica whispered. Richard entered the kitchen just in time to see the scene. He stood silently in the doorway, shame washing over him. He had always thought he was just doing his job, but now he had to face the reality that his actions had devastated his family. "Richard, you can't let this go on," Jessica said, noticing her husband's presence. You need to do something not just for us, but for the people you've hurt. Richard didn't respond. He turned and left the room. But Jessica's words echoed in his mind throughout the day. While Richard's family grappled with the fallout from public outrage, Elise also faced increasing pressure. Advocacy groups urged her to push harder in her fight, while extremist groups bombarded her with threats via phone, email, and even handwritten letters. One evening, as Elise sat in her office working, her assistant, Mia, entered with a large envelope in hand. "Ms. Elise, we've received another threatening letter," Mia said, her voice tinged with worry. Elise took the envelope, opened it, and read its contents. The letter was filled with hateful language and a warning that if she didn't stop, she would face severe consequences. Mia watched Elise anxiously. "Do you think we should report this to the police?" Elise placed the letter on her desk and sighed. "We've reported every letter so far, but it doesn't seem like they're taking it seriously." Mia nodded, pausing before adding, "Are you sure you want to keep going? We're dealing with people who seem willing to do anything to silence you." Elise gazed out the window at the shimmering city lights. "Mia, I can't stop. If I stay silent, they win. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for all the people who don't have a chance to be heard. This is my responsibility." Though still worried, Mia said nothing more. She knew Elise was not someone who could be easily intimidated. Richard spent countless sleepless nights, haunted by the video and the accusations from his family. He began reading articles and watching videos about racism and the injustices within the system he had once believed to be flawless. One day, he received a call from a former colleague, Marcus, the only black officer who had ever worked in the same police unit as him. Marcus had left the force years ago, unable to tolerate the discriminatory environment. "Richard, I'm not sure why I'm calling you, but I think you need to hear this," Marcus began. "You were wrong, not just in how you treated Elise Carter, but in how you see the world." Richard remained silent, listening intently. Marcus continued, "I used to think you were a good person, but I realized you, like so many others, never questioned the system you served. You need to change, not just for yourself, but for your family." Marcus's words lingered in Richard's mind. For the first time in his life, he began to admit that he had been wrong, not just in one isolated moment, but in his entire mindset, shaped by a deeply ingrained system of values he had never questioned. Richard decided to meet with a local social justice group to listen to the stories of those who had been victims of discrimination. He sat quietly in their meetings, listening to painful testimonies and slowly realizing that what he once thought of as doing the right thing was, in fact, part of a much larger problem. One morning, Elise received an envelope at her office. Unlike the previous threatening letters, this one was carefully handwritten, addressed to Congresswoman Elise Carter. Elise opened the envelope and read the letter inside. It was an apology letter from Richard Donovan. In it, he admitted his mistakes and expressed his remorse. "I know that my apology cannot undo the harm I caused you, but I want you to know that I am trying to change. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand I was wrong. And I will do everything I can to ensure no one else has to endure what you went through." Elise set the letter down, feeling a mix of surprise and relief. This wasn't something she had expected from Richard, but it was a sign that change might be possible. Mia walked in and noticed Elise holding the letter. "What's that?" she asked. Elise handed the letter to Mia. After reading it, Mia asked, "What do you think? Are you going to meet with him?" Elise paused, thinking carefully before replying. "I don't know, but if he's truly trying to change, I think we should give him a chance." After much thought, Elise decided to meet with Richard Donovan. She understood that this wasn't just an opportunity to confront him, but also a chance to foster change. The meeting took place at a small cafe, where both agreed to keep the encounter private to avoid media attention. Elise arrived first, sitting in a corner of the room. She wore a dark suit, exuding confidence, though her eyes revealed a guarded demeanor. Richard entered shortly after, wearing a simple shirt. He looked tired and slightly tense. He sat down across from Elise, his gaze searching hers, seemingly seeking acceptance. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Richard began softly. Elise nodded, maintaining her calm demeanor. "I hope you have something worthwhile to say." Richard lowered his head, pausing before speaking. "I know my apology isn't enough, but I need to tell you that I truly regret what I've done. I've spent the past weeks reflecting on my actions, and I've realized that I was wrong, not just in how I treated you, but in how I viewed the world." Elise didn't respond immediately. She studied Richard, trying to discern the sincerity in his eyes. "What do you plan to do to make things right?" she asked, her tone cold and measured. Richard took a deep breath. "I've joined community support groups. I've been listening to the stories of people who have been victims of discrimination. I'm trying to understand what they, and you, have endured. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of creating a better future." Elise kept her sharp gaze fixed on him. "Do you understand the damage your actions caused? You didn't just hurt me. You hurt my family, my supporters, and everyone who trusted in the justice system you represented." Richard nodded, his voice trembling. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to make amends." The conversation lasted over an hour. Elise listened, though she wasn't quick to forgive. However, she recognized that Richard was genuinely trying to change. As the meeting ended, Elise looked at Richard and said, "I can't promise I'll forgive you, but if you're truly serious, I'll be watching your actions." After his meeting with Elise, Richard decided to take a significant step, publicly admitting his mistakes. He wrote a lengthy letter addressed to human rights organizations and posted it on social media. In it, he recounted his story, from the prejudices instilled in him as a child to the transformation he experienced after meeting Elise. The letter caused a stir in public discourse. Many praised Richard for his courage, while others criticized him for his past actions. However, Richard didn't let the criticism deter him. He continued participating in panel discussions and workshops on equality and police reform. Meanwhile, the police department concluded its internal investigation. Richard was officially suspended and required to attend retraining programs focused on equality and human rights. It was a severe penalty, but Richard accepted it without protest. Elise, in her role as a Congresswoman, continued pushing forward the police reform bill. The legislation included provisions for enhanced equality training for officers, the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms, and protections for individuals facing discrimination. When the bill was introduced to Congress, it received strong support from the public and social activists. Ultimately, the bill passed, marking a significant milestone in the fight against racial discrimination. Despite losing his job, Richard didn't return to his old ways. Instead, he focused on self-improvement and giving back to the community. He became a mentor at a nonprofit organization, sharing his story to warn others about the dangers of prejudice and discrimination. One day, Richard received an invitation to speak at a major panel discussion where Elise Carter was a featured guest. Initially, he hesitated, fearing his presence might spark controversy. However, he ultimately decided to attend, hoping his story could provide some meaningful insight. At the event, Richard stood before hundreds of people and shared his journey of transformation. He didn't try to justify his past mistakes but emphasized that change is possible if we are willing to confront our flaws. When he finished his speech, Elise stepped onto the stage, took his hand, and said, "This is proof that we can change. But this change only matters if it leads to real action." The audience rose to their feet in applause, not just for Elise, but for Richard as well, who had bravely confronted his own shortcomings. The story of Elise and Richard became an inspiration for many. Movements for equality spread, not just within the city but across the nation. More police officers began participating in human rights training programs, and community organizations were established to foster solidarity among different racial groups. Elise continued her political career, becoming a symbol of hope and change. She not only fought for the rights of people of color but also championed policies to protect women, children, and the vulnerable. Richard, though no longer a police officer, found new meaning in serving the community. He worked tirelessly to make amends for his mistakes, becoming an active part of the reform movement he once resisted. The story concludes with Elise and Richard attending a community meeting together, where they listened and collaborated to find solutions for the challenges that remained. This was not just the end of one journey but the beginning of a brighter future. Elise Carter never anticipated that her story would have such a profound impact. After the police reform bill was passed, she received countless letters and messages from people across the country. Many shared their own experiences, thanking Elise for speaking out and paving the way for change. In a national television interview, Elise reflected on her journey. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. We can't change the entire world in a single day, but every action, every voice contributes to making a difference." Her words quickly became an inspirational quote, widely shared on social media and featured on billboards across the country. Elise was honored at numerous major events, but she always emphasized that this success wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had tirelessly fought for justice. She also took time to meet with victims of racial discrimination, listening to their stories and helping them seek legal support. Meanwhile, Richard Donovan, whose actions had sparked the initial incident, continued to publicly acknowledge his mistakes. He appeared in a documentary about racism within the police system, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned. The documentary garnered significant attention, helping many realize that changing one's mindset is not only possible but necessary. Richard realized that to move forward, he needed to confront his past. After appearing in the documentary, he decided to return to his hometown, the place where his prejudices had been formed. His hometown was a small, predominantly white town where conservative and racist attitudes were still prevalent. As Richard stepped into the cafe he used to visit every morning with his father, curious eyes immediately turned toward him. The townspeople had heard about his story through the media, and their feelings toward him were a mix of anger and disappointment. An older man, a close friend of Richard's father, spoke up. "Richard, I don't understand why you're kneeling to those people. Don't you see you're betraying your own hometown?" Richard remained calm, though he felt uneasy inside. He stood up, looked the man straight in the eye, and said, "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm just trying to make amends for my mistakes. If you had ever been in their shoes, looked down on and humiliated simply because of your skin color, you would understand." The man fell silent, but the atmosphere in the cafe grew tense. A few younger people stepped forward to express their support for Richard. They told him that his story had inspired them to stand up against the injustices in their own town. Richard left the cafe feeling a heavy weight, but also a glimmer of hope. He understood that changing the mindset of a community wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to do his part. Throughout her journey of fighting for justice, Elise realized that compassion was the greatest strength in confronting injustice. She decided to write a book sharing her story, from the struggles of her childhood to her confrontation with Richard and her efforts to reform the system. The book, titled Light in the Darkness, quickly became a phenomenon. It not only recounted the events that had unfolded but also offered lessons on empathy, courage, and how individuals can contribute to a more just society. Elise also established a charitable foundation to support victims of racial discrimination and those fighting for justice. The foundation provided legal assistance and funded educational programs to raise awareness about equality. During a book launch event at a university, a young student asked Elise, "Did you ever think you would fail?" Elise smiled. "Of course, but I also understood that failure is just a part of the journey. What matters is that you don't give up. Every step, no matter how small, can lead to significant change." Many years after the events that transformed their lives, Elise and Richard continued their journeys in different ways. Elise, now a nationally renowned politician, persisted in advocating for policies that protect human rights and promote equality. She became a role model for many young people, especially women of color, who saw in her a beacon of hope and inspiration. Richard, no longer a police officer, found purpose in his new work. He dedicated himself full-time to a nonprofit organization, where he organized workshops for young police officers, teaching them the importance of empathy and compassion in their roles. At a major community event in the city, Elise and Richard crossed paths again for the first time in years. Richard approached Elise, extended his hand, and said, "I want to thank you, not only for giving me the chance to change, but also for leading a movement that I'm proud to be part of." Elise smiled. "It wasn't me. You chose to change. And I'm glad you did." Their story became a symbol of hope, forgiveness, and the power of transformation. It reminded everyone that no matter how dark the past may seem, we can create light if we are willing to confront our mistakes and work toward a better future.